Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Fall 2020 series of Coffee with the Profs. Coffee with the Profs is one of the MSU Alumni Office's long-standing featured offerings, and it highlights research and work done by some of MSU's finest faculty and staff. I'm Elizabeth Wheeler, the coordinator of the program, and I'm your host for this series. Whether this is your first time or you're a series regular, we're pleased to have you joining us. And I know for a fact that we do have a number of new people joining us today. So on that topic, we're doing a quick poll, and it should be popping up in your screen now. We'd appreciate it if you take a second to answer that and let us know if this is your first time attending. Okay. Before we get started, I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do. The format for Coffee with the Profs is a 60-minute presentation by the featured professor, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and you can do so by utilizing the Q&A icon, which is located in the tool ribbon. I'll be collecting the questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to address them during the Q&A segment. Also, we are recording the presentation, and it will be available in our live stream archive on the MSU Alumni Office website within 1 week. So on to today's presentation. Our speaker is Tim Voss, who's the professor and director of the School of Journalism at Michigan State University. Tim came to MSU in June of 2019. He previously served on the communication faculty at Seton Hall University and was an associate professor and chair of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. A native Iowan, Tim was a first-generation college student. He earned his doctorate in mass communication from the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communication at Syracuse University. He worked as a broadcast journalist for 12 years, during which time he wrote for local and national publications and interviewed most of the major party candidates for U.S. president. Tim's research focuses on the role of journalism, media sociology, and gatekeeping, with an eye on media history and media policy. His work has examined the changes happening in print, broadcast, and digital news, as well as public relations and advertising. He is also the president of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, the field's leading research, teaching, and service organization. Welcome, Tim, and with that, I'll turn it over to you for Journalism in the Crosshairs and at a Crossroads.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to all for being here today. It's a pleasure to be part of the Coffee with the Profs, and thanks to the MSU Credit Union for sponsoring this event. All right, I will share my screen. So, there's a lot of discourse today about the problems facing journalism, and journalism maybe even bringing some of these problems on itself. So fake news has become sort of part of the vocabulary of a country and of journalists. And enemies of the people has also entered into the public discourse as a way of talking about journalism and news media broadly. And of course, journalists don't look too kindly on these designations. They see themselves much differently from this. And what I'd like to sort of explore today is, where journalists situate themselves in this discourse, how they see themselves. They certainly are aware that they're in the crosshairs. They believe that by and large they do not deserve that fate, but they also recognize that journalism is at a crossroads, that the way journalism has been done and was done for decades and even a few generations is probably not sustainable moving forward. So how do journalists confront this discourse? Well, let's dive into the discourse first of all, and say that this designation of fake news and enemies of the people, are not brand new. We've heard discourse critical of the media from national leaders on many occasions. Some of you will probably even remember, if you're my age or older, the Vice President, Spiro Agnew, being sort of the attack dog for President Nixon, and being very critical of the press, calling the press the nattering nabobs of negativism, an effete corps of impudent snobs, and he had a whole bunch of very alliterative phrases to disparage journalists and news media performance. Before that, there had been criticism of the press as well. I could point out Teddy Roosevelt, who had, in many respects, a lot of sympathy for journalists, also had huge battles with journalists, of course, calling a certain kind of journalism muckraking journalism, which stuck, and journalists wore as a badge of pride moving forward from those encounters with Roosevelt. And we could even go back to President John Adams, who had very bitter fights with journalists. The interesting thing, though, with Adams, this is in the period before journalism was really a profession. There was still not this sort of professional orientation. When we get to Teddy Roosevelt's era, that was the period when journalists were trying to develop this professional ethic and professional identity. And they held that identity very firmly at the time that Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew were in office. So, Nixon and Agnew signaled the time of criticism of the press, and I'll get into some reasons for probably why they did those sorts of things in a moment. But when we get to 2020 here, and even in the past few years, we recognize that adding phrases like enemies of the people does ratchet up the rhetorical attacks on journalists rather considerably. Now, I say this is not unheard of because, of course, it's happened in our history, but it's also happening in other countries as well. So we do this also, we think about this in the context of declining trust and credibility of journalists. Some important context here is that almost all institutions are experiencing waning trust. And the waning trust in journalism in the US is paralleled by waning trust in journalism abroad as well. So we're in this larger sort of historical moment where the news media, again, find themselves in a crosshairs and are reevaluating themselves. Another important context here for what I want to talk about in the next several minutes is this also happens within a context of rising political polarization. And I suspect most of you know what that means. That the country, that citizens have very strong political identities. They have very strong feelings about other political parties. And that notion of the voter who would educate her or himself and think about the issues and arrive at independent conclusions about individual candidates, that has largely given way to citizens who are not easily persuaded by discourse of candidates, but also not easily persuaded by what they learn in the news media. People have very strong political identity. So this era of rising political polarization that we're in creates an important context. Interestingly, I mean, the U.S. has been polarized before, and I would say that in each of those cases, there's not many of these cases, we have to go back almost to the founding of the country, but when there was deep polarization, the press also reflected that polarization in many ways, largely by being more partisan themselves. So again, fake news, enemies of the people, not entirely new discourse, but qualitatively different. When news of the people has been used in the past, it was in places like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, where the term was used to marginalize dissidents and even to justify violence. So, that knowledge of the history of those terms, of course, is somewhat disconcerting to journalists. So here's just a brief image. It only goes up to January of 2019 that is showing Donald Trump's rhetoric about the press. So there are tweets that are critical of the press, but there are these punctuated periods of using terms like fake news, calling them the opposition party, and then the enemy of the people. And we see how, that there's not a straight line here, but there's definitely an emerging pattern of negative discourse about the press. But, that's not just, it's not just Trump that is being critical of the press. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. So enemies of the people, this is not just a metaphor. People take this seriously and sometimes literally. So there's been considerable violence against journalists around the world for a long period of time, but considerable violence in the US as well. Not as severe as elsewhere, but one of the images that I have here in the upper right-hand corner is of the Capitol, a newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland, where a number of staff members were shot and killed in June of 2018. And in that particular case, again, I'm not tying this to presidential rhetoric. I'm saying that this idea of the press being an enemy is indeed held by a number of people who, and in this particular case, the gunman had been charged with harassing an acquaintance. This was reported in the paper. He filed a defamation case, which was summarily dismissed, and then he took to violence. We've seen many other examples of violence during the summer protests. Reporters were routinely beaten, sometimes shot by rubber bullets, and the like. We've heard stories of the press being singled out at rallies that President Trump has held around the country, and certainly a lot of verbal abuse and some minor incidents of throwing objects at journalists and the like. But this is something that journalists take very seriously. They realize that they have put themselves in harm's way in the contemporary setting in which the press is seen as being some sort of malicious force. The other image I have here is of JSafe. It's an app that was developed particularly for women journalists to track their movements and to report suspicious activity because they're concerned about violence directed at them. And it does seem that women have borne a particular brunt of online trolls and other sort of harassing behavior. So, women's sports journalists have endured this for a long time. There was an odd case that you may or may not have heard of that was known as Gamergate. And there's many dimensions to that whole episode, but a lot of it was directed by individuals who, play computer games and so forth, attacking women journalists who were writing often about the misogyny found in violent video games. So again, women see themselves as a target in all of this. So why is the news media in the crosshairs? Well, part of this might just be, this is a performance review that the public is offering and they don't like what they see. And that's not an unreasonable conclusion. There are certainly many missteps that we can point to on the part of journalists, and that's why they find themselves in the position that they are. Part of it probably, though, is the messenger, the idea of shooting the messenger. So keeping with the metaphor of journalism in the crosshairs, we see that when you're bringing bad news, bringing critical news, bringing news that's very unwelcome, people's initial or maybe even long-term emotional response to that is to, or cognitive response is to identify the media as the problem in all of this. A third reason maybe why the news media finds themselves in the crosshairs, and this where we start to overlap a little bit more with some of my own research, is this idea of flack. Flack is it's like when you give people a hard time, you criticize them, you maybe even harass them. But in journalism, there's a long history of people in power doing this because they want to manage the media. They want to move the media a certain direction. So back to Spiro T. Agnew and Richard M. Nixon, a lot of what they did fell under this rubric of flack as a form of media management. By being really critical of the press for being liberal, and that's really when this discourse starts to emerge of the liberal press. I mean, it becomes much more part of the public awareness is during this period. But Nixon and Agnew, I mean, they had real hostility to the press, especially Nixon. But the idea was if you call the press liberal because they see themselves as objective, they'll seek to balance that. They'll go out of their way to maybe be as critical of the Democratic Party and maybe less critical of the Nixon administration. And there was some empirical proof that that was indeed the case, that journalists were more critical of Democrats subsequent to some of this media management. Another one of the possible reasons why the news media find themselves in the crosshairs is because there is an intention to dislodge journalism from this historic role of being an arbiter of truth. If the news media is seen as an arbiter of truth, then the news media has the legitimacy and authority to say what is true and what's not. And for politicians who aren't always truthful, that's an unwelcome form of critique and correction. So if you don't believe what the news media has to say, then the idea is that you won't believe the criticism of the particular leader or politician who is lying or doing awful things. But again, part of the context here. So these are sort of maybe reasons why the news media are in the position they are. But again, we have to see this against the backdrop and in the context of significant political polarization. That this undercutting of journalistic authority is because of the political polarization, or the flack is because of that. But there's also some shifting market conditions here that sort of links, and these things are definitely linked, as are shifting social values. So journalists used to sort of shoot for middle America and the middle of the political spectrum because they believed that would appeal to all kinds of demographics and all kinds of groups. But when there isn't really a political center, when there's, you know, a left and a right, the market incentive is not to go to the middle anymore, because that's a losing proposition. You're just going to turn off both poles. You really have to aim your messages or craft your news for one of those two poles. So those kinds of polarization leads to a change in the market, which also maybe explains why news organizations are responding the way they are to this new environment. And then also shifting market conditions. I'll talk more about this later, but you know, the advertising model for journalism is failing. It is no longer robust. The future of journalism support through advertising is on the line right now. So, you know, that's also a concern. And then there's just these shifting social values as well. A growth in incivility. We see this sort of in the troll culture. If you ever read comments with news stories, you've maybe seen this for yourself. Journalists sometimes have referred to you know, the comments sections of newspapers and online outlets as a fetid swamp, where it's just a breeding ground for incivility. So that's the situation in which, you know, journalists find themselves at present. So my apologies that this isn't a really great high definition image here, but this was a study that was done a couple of years ago now. And basically what it shows is an array of media, and we're looking at sort of two poles here. So the bottom line that you see is political bias, and those on the right are right-leaning publications. Those on the left are left-leaning publications, obviously enough. But then the other pole going up and down refers to the credibility, or excuse me, the reliability and accuracy of journalist reporting. So again, this was a study done of accuracy of reporting, and then spread out by political bias. So even though there might be, you know, if you look to the top of the chart here and slightly to the right, you'll see the Wall Street Journal, but it's very high on this list. Its reports are accurate and factual. At the top of the list are two wire services, the Associated Press and Reuters. Of course, they're providing news to all kinds of political outlets, so that certainly makes sense. You know, off to the far right, we see, you know, InfoWars and News Punch and Red State and the like. And over on the left, we see Wonkat and Palmer Report and some others. Interestingly, down sort of in the bottom middle, there are a couple of outlets that are not particularly politically biased, the Inquirer and World Truth, but they're not accurate, right? There's a lot of literally fake news in all of that. So this does also sort of support, if we just look at that axis of political bias, that there is a spread of biased news outlets, again, probably responding to the market realities of a polarized world. So when it comes to journalism public trust, a lot of the concern right now is with presidential rhetoric, but we should be aware that it's more than just the president who has been criticizing the press. There is a record of a great deal of suspicion on the part of historically marginalized communities of the news media. Particularly, we see again with Black Lives Matter and protests over the last year that some of the anger and frustration has been geared to news media because the news media are seen as simply supporting the status quo and treating protests as sort of deviant behavior. In fact, there's a lot of research done about how the press really focuses on deviant behavior, like during a protest. So, protests overwhelmingly peaceful, people, overwhelmingly civil, but the news media focuses on those instances where people are being violent or just appear to be really, strange. And this is true of protests on the right as well. It's not a right versus left thing. The press, when it comes to sort of, groups that are on the margins, really portrays them as lacking legitimacy and even lacking civility. The other image I have here refers to the Kerner Commission. Many of you may be aware that the Kerner Commission was a response in the late 1960s to riots and violence and so forth in a number of cities across the U.S. But a key part of that Kerner Commission pointed out that news media were really complicit and did horrible coverage and perpetuated racism in many respects. And the Kerner Commission also pointed out that the mainstream press was still largely white men and called for the need for more journalists of color to be employed. So, as I've indicated, public trust has not been favorable of journalists, but I'd like to hear from you. I want to sort of know who I'm talking to here today as well. So how much trust do you put in the media? And we have a poll where we're going to ask the question. So try to get this done as quickly as possible here because we don't want to belabor this for long. So I trust the news media very much, somewhat, distrust the news media somewhat, or distrust the news media very much. And by the way, these questions are not all that dissimilar to how these questions are posed in polls for a number of years, gauging trust. Sometimes the poll will put a middle point in there of not having a lot of, being neutral, and we didn't leave it there. So what do we have here? Well, okay, a fairly trusting view of journalism shows up here. Very much, about a quarter of you who responded. And then 57% who say they trust the news media somewhat. And then there are the others here: distrust it somewhat, 13%, and distrust it very much, 5%. So, okay. That's not, again, all that different probably from some national perceptions. Right now, it's about 59% of Americans who expressed a general trust in news media. Historically, that's down a bit, as I'll suggest in a moment. But it's also sort of interesting because, here's a picture you recognize, some of you will recognize anyhow, of Walter Cronkite, the news anchor who was considered the most trusted man in America at a particular point. That seems like, a nostalgic moment when we think about journalists today being considered the most trusted person in America. Now, when we look a little more deeply into these trust numbers, and these numbers only go through 2018, but we show a big difference by political party. So this is a Gallup poll done in 2019, and it shows here that Democrats, by and large, are much more trusting of the news media, ending up at 76%, independents at 42%, and Republicans at 21%. And I'm not going to, try to belabor an explanation for that right now. But what's interesting when, we ask people about trust in mass media, and by the way, it says mass media here, but it was actually asking about news media. But when we ask other kinds of questions like, the news media in general, or the news media that you use most often, then there's a different view. Still, not high levels of trust, but definitely a difference. So sometimes there can be this sort of generalized distrust. I don't think I trust this institution. But when they think about the particular news media that they consume, they form a different impression. So that's how, again, the public is maybe viewing journalism in a sort of broad way, but then how do journalists view themselves? How do they see themselves in this context at present? So overwhelmingly, journalists identify as a profession, or even as a social institution whose main charge is to be this handmaiden to democracy. And this has been true now for several decades, where journalists, when they articulate their purpose and their value, they underscore the role that they play in democracy. So that said, there are different views of democracy that journalists have. I've done a bit of research on this as well, and I have a piece that is being reviewed for publication at present that also goes into this, that journalists look at democracy in different ways. Some of it is about simply identifying corruption and incompetence, and if they see that, then they bark, they blow the whistle, they do whatever they do to bring people's attention to it, with the idea that voters will then respond to corruption and incompetence and vote out corrupt and incompetent leadership. It's a pretty actually narrow version of democracy. It's not really about the citizens deliberating and so forth, but we see that more, if I drop down to the bottom one here, providing a forum for ideas. There are a set of journalists who believe this is what's central to democracy, that democracy is about mutual deliberation, cross-examination, debating ideas, and then arriving at some point of consensus or a point going forward. And for some journalists, they see it as their role to be that faithful portrayer of that discourse and to provide a forum for that debate and discussion so that people will feel invested in political decisions that are made. And then there's also just this sort of middle ground where it's believed, understandably, of course, that for democracy to function, people need good, reliable information. And that's what their role is, to provide accurate, independent, verified information. So, sorry for throwing up a table here that will be sort of hard to read. So let me just sort of walk you through it very quickly. This also involves some of my own research. So I call myself a journalism studies scholar because I'm studying journalism and how journalists see journalism and how journalism functions. And we asked a random sample, representative sample of US journalists, what they saw as their role. And they could respond again, that it's extremely important, very important, on down to extremely unimportant. And reporting things as they are is at the top of the list. That's what journalists see themselves as being most committed to and as central to their role. Educate the audience, again, sort of ties into this democratic function, provide information people need to make political decisions. Now, if you look at the bottom, there are a number of questions like support government policy, convey a positive image of political leadership, support national development, which get very low buy-in from journalists. So why did we even ask them those questions? Well, this was an international survey. I surveyed journalists in the US. There were surveys of journalists in 66 countries in total in this study. And in other parts of the world, support government policy actually is quite a bit higher. But in Western countries and democracies, we see very similar results. Down near the bottom of the list, set the political agenda. That one is a much more mixed around the world, but US journalists largely have stayed away from any kind of role that suggests they're the ones who are doing the leading, that they're the ones who are, influencing public opinion, also very low. In their perception, they would reflect it or they would report on it, but not be in a leadership role. Okay, this next slide, just very quickly, I put up where we also asked journalists, what is it that you think that influences your work or shapes your work? And the overwhelming answer is journalism ethics. They believe that that ethical codes, like the Society of Professional Journalists, has this code of ethics, and that it's that code that guides them in their work. Again, just quick a quick snapshot of that. So why the disconnection? And again, here's a table that's really hard to make sense of, but let me just point out what it's showing. So again, this is my own research. I just showed you the results from journalists about how they ranked their roles, but then we asked the public, what do you think the role of journalism, of the press, should be? And in every single case, they rate the role differently. So they might still prioritize it the same way. Be a detached observer is sort of at the top of the list. That's very important to journalists, but the public see it as pretty important too, but clearly not as important as journalists do. And basically, the other numbers in here are just saying that this difference, it's not a minor difference. It's not just a difference of chance. This is probably quite likely it's only a 1 in 1,000 chance that this is by chance. These are real differences between the press and the public. So again, part of the good news here is that journalists and the public are not pulling in completely different directions. They're not rating these things in polar opposite ways. But they don't necessarily see eye to eye. So maybe there is a source of a little bit of a disconnect right there. So I want to start trying to think about how we explain the disconnection. And here I think are a couple of important contexts. So one is that journalists often talk about the news industry or the journalism industry. So there is this sense that what they do is a business, and it operates within a context of a marketplace in which they have to meet a public need and perhaps even public demand. On the other hand, there's this strong culture within journalism of seeing themselves as part of a profession. And having professional values and an obligation to public service. And these two orientations are sometimes in conflict. When it comes to particular issues, that conflict can even be quite pronounced. Because, of course, as a profession and being geared to public service, but do you give the public simply what they want? Well, what if what they want isn't, verified truth claims? Do you just then give them something else? At the core of this notion of journalism as a profession is the idea of autonomy, that journalists have to make independent judgments. They can't be influenced by external factors, political parties, that sort of thing. And they're going to make a judgment on what is true, but also what is important based on what they see as their public service obligation. Okay, so those two orientations are going to play out now in ways that produce somewhat biased coverage. So when journalism is seen as an industry and journalists think of themselves as being players in the marketplace, we see some subtle and not so subtle biases begin to shade and color the news. So one of them is the sensationalism bias. Sensationalism is the way that that you get the biggest audience, and the biggest audience means that you can turn around and sell that audience to advertisers at a higher rate. So there's this economic pull to cast the news in a way that is not reporting things as they are. So we see this intention to what journalists see as their role. And some of you, of course, I'm not looking at the comments just yet in the chat. Some of you are going to say, well, this is what journalists say they do, but what do they really do? And that's another major area of my research. Spoiler alert here, it turns out they don't always achieve what they say that they do. But it is a healthy tension in the sense that their belief in their role does keep them from some really bad influences and leads to some self-correction. I won't go through all of these biases in length here. The glory bias, though, is just the idea of actually something that we see in broadcast journalism more than anywhere else, but in print journalism, it's getting your byline on the front page. For broadcast journalists, it's the most airtime they get in the newscast and things like that. And those lures end up subtly shading how journalists report the news. The expediency bias is one where, it is a business, right? This idea that journalism, well, not just the idea, but that journalism, is not done for free. It costs money to produce, and producing the news is often very costly in and of itself, which of course is a worrying factor when we think about the changing market conditions for journalism. But what that means is that news organizations sometimes cut corners. They're satisfied with having done what they believe to be sufficient research, but maybe if they kept at it longer, they would come up with different conclusions. A-list bias basically means that journalists focus on people with big name recognition. Donald Trump got way disproportionate amount of coverage during the presidential campaign leading up to 2016 because people knew him from The Apprentice. He was a celebrity. And celebrities get more airtime because if they get more airtime, that gets more viewer attention or page views or whatever else. So that fits into this industry bias as well. And then there's just this bad news bias that bad news seems to sell more than good news. So all of that, again, back to reporting things as they are, well, news is biased in this way. But journalism as a profession also, it can be a source of bias. I just want to back up for just a second to this particular issue. There's a story in the New York Times that I just saw this morning. I'm not sure if it was posted just today or not, but it is a critical examination of the Times' own coverage of terrorist groups. It focuses on a particular reporter whose reports maybe were not entirely accurate. And almost all of these things come up: expediency bias, sensationalism bias, glory bias, bad news bias, all manifest in the Times reporting some stories that they're now going back and looking at and say, we think that maybe some of that is going to prove to be problematic. Okay, so the profession as a bias. Also, the bad news bias shows up here again. That journalists as a profession, by and large, because they see themselves as a watchdog, as a monitor of wrongdoing, of a correction in democracy, just their professional disposition is to look for corruption, to look for incompetence, and so forth. And when they do that, of course, then they're not looking at other things, or maybe even magnifying, sort of minor incompetence as major incompetence because they see that as so central to their role. A narrative bias is one where, so an interesting phenomena in journalism in the last about 15 years or so is that they've begun to talk about themselves as storytellers. Because of the rise of bloggers and citizen journalism and so forth, information is ubiquitous in a networked internet environment. So, getting the news first used to be what journalists would hang their hat on and say, see, we're really connected. We're really on top of things because we got the news first. Well, now getting the news first is a matter of getting it 2 seconds ahead of somebody else. So there's no big payoff in that. So they've recast their value that they're adding as telling powerful, impactful stories. Of course, powerful, impactful stories require strong characters. They require conflict. This rising sort of climax and denouement, and that becomes a structure in which then journalists sort of narrate events, where again they're going to sort of highlight drama and so forth. Status quo bias, I referred to this a little bit earlier when I was talking about the Kerner Commission and so forth. Coverage of public protest often, almost always actually, marginalizes dissident views and portrays that the status quo is the reasonable and only way to do things. And then there's a fairness bias, and I don't really like the term fairness bias, but it's used in this sort of literature that examines these kind of phenomena. I would call it more a balance bias, and that's the idea that every news story needs to provide two equal perspectives on an issue. So a lot of criticism of the press around climate coverage and climate change has focused on what is called false balance, right? That you put in someone with very little sort of scientific credentials and elevating their position in terms of what the overwhelming number of scientists say about the causes of climate change. So journalists have actually re-examined that notion of always having to be balanced. And there's significant evidence that I've identified in some of my own research that is also in the review process right now, where journalists have really critically reevaluated whether balance is really part of their profession. Okay, so journalism at a crossroads, again, they confront a lot of connected issues here. I've talked about increasing polarization, decreasing trust. Just to point out a couple other things here, increasing digitalization. I won't belabor this point, but with the digital media environment, that's been very disruptive to current models of journalism. I already suggested, how journalists have shifted to putting more emphasis on narrative and not being first because of the digital environment. And there are many more examples to this, but digitization has also destabilized the economic model considerably. And it's also tied to sort of the shifting professional orientation. So I want to just pick up on these last couple here a little bit more. Very quickly, these numbers are sometimes referred to as the death spiral of journalism. They both focus on newspapers. The picture is not quite as bad for broadcast news, but it's facing a similar situation. Again, these numbers are not, or these dates are not completely current, but paid circulation of newspapers has plummeted, and advertising revenue and circulation revenue has also plummeted. So on the far right of the screen here, it's a line that's pretty much, it's not straight down, but that's a pretty significant drop off. And just briefly here, the number of news organizations continue to get a lot of engagement from folks on social media and on their websites and so forth, but that really can't be monetized in the same ways that newspapers could or broadcast coverage could, and that's what's sort of at stake here. But there's also a shifting professional orientation. So journalists are sort of rethinking how they think about the profession. I already mentioned false balance. But what we've seen in the last number of years is journalists taking more leadership in trying to arbitrate what is true and what is not true. In the past, they would put competing truth claims up there and allow the public to judge for themselves what they felt they could believe or not. And journalists have embraced, in many respects, fact-checking as a new kind of professional ethic. And of course, they would check for accuracy in the past, but they now see this as sort of a core mission of determining what is true and what is not true. So, PolitiFact was one of the first to really do this with their truthometer, pants on fire for things that were big lies and the like. Partisanship. A number of news organizations have embraced the fact that they're going to have a partisan take on the day's news, because that's what's going to be honest or truthful or straightforward. Fox News has played an outsized role in that regard, embracing a more partisan role. Interesting, though, they still use traditional journalistic values of being fair and balanced to talk about what they do. But even increasingly in the last few years, there's been less attention to try to justify it in terms of old journalistic values and just say this is what journalism is today. There's also been a strong movement in journalism, and I've done a fair amount of research on this as well, embracing the notion of transparency as a counter to objectivity. The idea is objectivity was just like, here are the facts, this is the truth, take it or leave it. With the notion of transparency, journalists say, okay, I'm going to tell you how I arrived at this. I'm going to tell you about myself, what my own background is, what my political views are. And if you know that, and you know how I put this story together, then you as the reader or viewer will have a better idea how you will judge the veracity of information that's provided. I also see a sort of rethinking of autonomy. So on autonomy and objectivity as these core values, they're rethinking autonomy as well. Part of what autonomy meant was that journalists would be autonomous from the business side of a news organization, and they would be autonomous from the listeners or the viewers or the readers, because they felt that that would be the path toward professionalism. Sensationalism, not professionalism. That this would be the path to giving people what they want, fluff news, and not what they need to be citizens in a democracy. But journalists are thinking now that maybe the public needs to be partners in what they do. So there's this real effort to engage the public, talk about issues with the audience, to understand and to listen to what they say. And journalists are rethinking this wall of separation between the business functions and the news functions of the publication. We see that in so-called sponsored stories. So one of the images here where news sites now, granted they label these as advertisements, but they're sort of blended in to a publication in a way that really makes it look like news stories. So, I don't have time to belabor this point. I raised the question whether there's room for new professional values to emerge. And I'll just mention the listening as an ethical value. A colleague and I did some research post the 2016 election, where we wanted to see how journalists thought about their performance during the election. And overwhelmingly, they said, we didn't listen to the people. We didn't know really what was on the people's mind. We were blindsided by Trump's election because, we were living on the coast. We didn't listen to people. But in our analysis, we also found out that journalists have a really thin notion of what listening means. It's maybe just like putting a poll out, but not really engaging with how people are thinking about things. So we think there's a lot of room there for a new sort of professional ethic that really speaks to the dignity of those people who you interview, who you are engaging with as journalists, and take their ideas seriously. So, roads heading. The nature of the crossroads, of course, is they head in different directions. So some roads are pointing toward polarization and partisanship. There are new approaches to thinking about the place of news media in the marketplace. There are these new professional values in front of us. And those values can head in different ways. Some rejecting objectivity, some embracing it, some rejecting autonomy, some embracing it. But can we really turn back the clock? And the answer to that, I think, is probably no, that we've crossed the point where that is really realistic. So I think there are some big questions ahead that journalists have to navigate. Are we just in a post-truth world in which journalism that sees itself as a truth teller is just out of step? That there is no way to discern some ultimate truth because we're just awash in competing truth claims. Is it even possible to be a gatekeeper any longer, to keep bad information out of the public sphere? Is it even desirable to do that? Do journalists have to police the information environment? Some believe absolutely yes, but they see it increasingly difficult and some almost impossible to do because information enters that public sphere from all over the place, not simply through the news media, as was the case a generation ago. And then, there's just the question, is, in this new sort of digital economy, in the gig economy, is there really a place for an institution of journalism? Those are some real tough views on the horizon as journalists emerge from those crossroads. So I will stop there and we can have a discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tim. I have to say, I, for one, am personally glad this is being recorded because I did not really have time to pay attention. I was monitoring the Q&A and the chat, and it's wonderful to see so many people engaged this morning. I think one of the hallmarks of the in-person version of Coffee with the Profs is the dialogue, and I'm pleased to see this occurring in our virtual space. So we have a lot of questions to get through. I don't know if we'll get through them all, but to everybody who has posed a question, I have taken them down, so I have noted them down, I should say, and then Tim and I will work together. If we cannot get them addressed during the time we have today, I'll provide them with Tim, and he can choose to follow up with you. So let's get started. I'm going to take it right from the top, so I got to scroll up here. So question, when you talk about the dwindling middle market, how would USA Today fit in? Is that no longer viable?
Well, I mean, they're in business still, but if you've picked up the paper, it's a lot thinner than what it used to be. The whole system of production of that paper has changed. They've looked for more and more efficiencies, and they've found those. So USA Today is owned by Gannett. Gannett owns a number of papers, including right here in Michigan, and they use those networks of papers to send news to a central place to be dealt with and so forth. So they continued to try that model, and there's still some support for it, right? I mean, even in a polarized world, there's still it's not a complete drop off. There is, but interestingly, now the center is the market niche. And it used to be that the niches were at the tails of a bell-shaped curve. Now that's not the case anymore. And there are a number of other entities like that who feel like there's a niche there for them at the center. One of those, and there were some questions ahead of time that Elizabeth passed on to me, and one of them was about Newsy. And it's interesting that someone asked about Newsy because the founder of Newsy, Jim Spencer, is someone I know fairly well. We have a connection through my time at the Missouri School of Journalism because Newsy was founded there, quite literally across the street from my office in Columbia, Missouri. But their model too is about trying to provide news that is not, biased. It's not geared to a particular partisan demographic, shooting for that center. And then to do that, of course, they feel like they really have to hang their hat on being accurate. So those are sometimes places to look for accurate and viable news.
Well, and on a similar topic, this is probably a very loaded question, but where do you find unbiased news sources?
Well, that chart that I showed, there is a point there in the center where at the high point there's accuracy. And even if you feel like, well, I don't like the news from ABC and CBS, which actually were really pretty high in the center of that. So not in the middle of the bias line and high on accuracy. There are news outlets that are there. They're wire services, but even if you lean one way or another, there's still publications there or news outlets that you can turn to. But in the environment that we're in right now, it's really hard for anyone to just focus on one news outlet. You really do sort of have to have, if you're really engaged, if you really are motivated, particularly if there is an issue that you think is really important to you professionally or personally, you need to read pretty broadly about that topic to form your own overall vision. Again, just based on the fact that we live in this polarized media system.
And I do want to point out, because a number of people have noted that the screen showing the various news media outlets and where they fall on that chart, I will make that available. We have the link, so I'll send that out afterwards so everybody can read it in all its glory and digest it to their little heart's content. So stay tuned.
Good. Thank you.
Next question. With polarization, why don't journalists give both views of the issues honestly?
Well, do they? That's an empirical question. Do they do it honestly? I don't know. In issues that I'm particularly motivated on, some I think they are fairly honest and straightforward. But of course, when it's your side of the issue, it's hard for us to make judgments on the objectivity of the journalists who are also then trying to be objective. Journalists would often say, if I make everybody angry, then I'm doing my job, because that assumed that, that both sides in a two-party battle saw the journalist as not fully embracing their point of view. I don't know that that's really a winning proposition. But part of the answer could just be that that journalists have, actually it's less the journalists and probably the news organization that embraces a partisan identity, and they're going to do what it takes to appeal to their target demographic. And if that means not giving full fairness to the other side, that might be what the news organization does.
Can you address the funding sources of particular media outlets as it relates to the public's trust of various news sources? For example, Jeff Bezos, as the owner of the Washington Post, the MSNBC is owned by Comcast. It seems that that's where the fake news moniker is the most applicable.
Yeah, and of course, you know, people point out the ownership of Fox News in that regard as well. Well, it sort of depends, because it's all about how the organizational structure works. So there's a long professional history here of publishers not interfering with editors and journalists doing their work. And the publisher is the owner, the source. So a strong professional culture of, we'll be critical even of ourselves. We'll be critical of, you know, NBC was owned by GE, General Electric, but NBC would still be critical of General Electric because they had autonomy. So that core professional value of autonomy insulated them to a certain extent from these influences. They just like, we're not going to pay attention to that, and we're going to tell it like it is. But that varies from organization to organization. How rigid are those professional ethics and norms? And there's not, to this point, and you know, the story can still be told, of Bezos having a lot of hands-on say in the running of that publication. And Rupert Murdoch has been more hands-on and putting people in positions that would advance his editorial viewpoint. So it's not always easy to determine, because we can't always lift up the hood and look inside and see how the organization is run. But there's also just this generalized effect of ownership, right? That if you're in it to make money, well, there's a set of biases, as I talked about, that go with that.
Okay. General question: what is the difference between news media and mass media?
Yeah. Okay. Well, mass media was a term used really in the 20th century that referred to all media. So like entertainment television, record companies, anyone that produced mediated messages or items for a mass audience. And it was always sort of a strange term because it wasn't very good at differentiating. You know, as I hate the media, well, it might be that they just, you know, don't like what NBC was showing in prime time on Thursday nights. That wasn't always a reflection on the newscast. So we've started to get a little more precise about the language there. But also the whole mass in mass media is an anachronism as well, right? That was the case in the 20th century when you had 3 and then 4 networks who could reach a mass undifferentiated audience. But now in the digital environment, there are all of these smaller audiences. There's not one big mass audience anymore. And again, in a more polarized environment, we don't have a mass media in the same way that we did. There's a whole other bunch of meanings to mass. It had this view, this undifferentiated audience and so forth. But that's why we sort of moved away from that term.
Okay. Next question. During my years as a newspaper reporter and editor, great care was taken to keep news and editorial content separate, thus affording a certain objectivity to the news coverage. That line seems increasingly blurred. Do you agree? And if so, what's the impact on public trust?
Yeah, so I only touched on this briefly when I was talking about that wall of separation. And I mentioned there the wall of separation was between the news side and the business side of a publication. But there was another meaning to that wall of separation that I didn't touch on. And that was the wall. There used to be this wall of separation between news and editorial. Both of those walls are being remodeled. And so one of the things that I've done is to sort of understand how journalists think about their profession over time. So I won't get into the details of my research here, because when researchers start talking about their research, they always go off the rails. But I've collected 250,000 pieces of journalists talking about journalism and done this analysis on it. And it's from like a 20-year period. And what you see is that this notion of a wall of separation starts out as this rule of journalism, a separation between news and business and between business and editorial. And over time, that wall erodes. It's seen as problematic. It's seen as part of the decline of journalism, because it's meant that journalists are detached from the public. It means that they're not thinking about business considerations when they should be, when newspapers are folding and news staffs are being cut and so forth. So, I mean, if you want accurate, fair information, that wall has to be high, it has to be firm, it has to be impenetrable. And again, some organizations, when you look under the hood, they still have a really solid wall there. Not all organizations do. They see it as problematic. And there are business reasons largely why they go down that path.
Okay. Reflecting back on the media bias chart, it outlines their continuum of news to analysis to opinion. So how do we help our friends and family members see that some of these sources are indeed what we would traditionally call news, facts only, and that others are inherently moving into analysis and opinion, blending their stories with the straight facts? So
yeah.
Put another way, we can all agree on the who, what, when. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, I'm really grateful for the question, because in the interest of time, I didn't go into the detail of what that chart shows. So I'm glad you're going to distribute it. And I would say just redistribute that chart. Because journalists do make distinctions. So, even back to the previous comment, a newspaper, so will label some items as news analysis. And of course, there's the opinion pages, there's the op-eds and so forth. We generally know what those are and how that's different from news, although not everyone gets that, but that's an important distinction to be made. But that analysis one is sort of sometimes seen as in between. And that's where I think there's maybe more confusion, where it's like, boy, journalists are really being biased here because we're hearing a lot of the journalist interpretation of things. Well, that's on purpose. It's the idea is well, they're not trying to be biased on purpose. What they're trying to do on purpose is to provide context, to provide meaning. This is what has been said, but let's put what's been said in context. Let's understand how this ties in historically, what's actually been done in conjunction with that discourse. So there are analysis pieces that try to provide this kind of education as well. Journalists are often the insiders. They know a lot of these details, and when they just report objectively, they feel like a lot of that context is stripped away. So analysis provides that context. But of course, once you start providing context, then you have some standpoint, you have some position of how you're evaluating something and looking at something. And some journalists are purposefully very transparent about that. They identify where they are socially, politically, religiously, and so forth, so that people can understand that's what's driving their analysis. Some analysts are not as explicit about that.
Well, and as on a tangent and very much related to that, so how do those of us who believe in the press counteract the claims that all media are biased and proponents of fake news?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's such a I'll say an irresponsible argument to make that just all news is to be discounted, because then we really do live in a post-truth world, right? And then we really have done the proverbial throwing dust in the umpire's eyes, and at that point it's not it's not a fair game anymore. So I guess, here's just one answer, and it's not the best answer or the most elaborate answer, but I would respond by saying, careful what you disparage. Do you really want us to be in a position where there are no arbiters of truth? We need journalism, don't we? We need someone who can make an independent judgment about the veracity of information that goes into policy and public decision making. So part of it would just be, we need this. And if they're motivated by the need, if they see the importance, I think that's the next step to then saying, well, here are some sources that are more accurate than others.
Okay. If advertising is a failing model and consumers are reluctant to pay for online content, what is a successful economic model for journalistic media?
Well, and if I had an authoritative answer to that question right now, I probably wouldn't be sitting behind this desk. I could have made myself very wealthy by now. It's the question that's been hanging over journalism now, really right in journalism's face for over a decade, and there's still not an answer. So I do know that in other places in the world, they have a public media model so that there's public support for journalism, so a public subsidy for journalism. There are places where that has been done poorly, where the politicians ultimately hold the purse strings in ways that are not easily controlled, and hence it makes it easier for politicians to control the funding of news media, and hence to punish some media and reward others. But there are a number of countries that have really strong public policies that set up a system that really prevents policymakers and politicians and others from interfering in who exactly gets the money, but it's generally tax dollars and so forth, and that goes to supporting media. So that is a model that's worked in other countries, but it takes a really smart policy eye to craft that correctly. One of the other models that's seen a bit of success is a sort of community support model. So some of that started in sort of rural communities, that had a farmers co-op, so they would come together, essentially creating almost like a public utility because it was in everyone's self-interest to have that. They needed that. No one could afford it necessarily on their own. So what's grown from that is also a sort of a community support model. Again, it's a community coming together. And that's kind of how NPR works, although it's a different kind of community. It's not a geographical community as such. Well, there's a geographical component when you and I send our money to WKAR, right? Yes, we do. Okay, good. So, I mean, does news media really need to make a profit to provide the service that we want it to provide? Can they be operated as nonprofits? Some nonprofits have failed, but many of them are working. The old economic model had a pretty substantial amount of profit going to publishers and to investors and so forth. A really high margin, anywhere from 20 to 40%. So, they were cutting good journalism for profit. If we can, and hence these nonprofit models seem to be working a bit better. But again, in all these cases, the jury is still out.
Well, and picking up on that, we actually have two questions related to the media outlets that are free to read. They tend to be a little bit more on the biased ends of the spectrum, while those that produce unbiased tend to be pay for consumption. So how does having to pay affect people's consumption and trust in the media, and how can this be combated in the short term potentially?
Yeah, I mean, the question is really insightful, because it just underscores that the way that any media is funded is going to influence the kind of news that we get. So I mentioned I'm part of this Worlds of Journalism study. We are now ramping up to do the next Worlds of Journalism study with over 100 countries. And unfortunately, it's on hold right now because of COVID. But this is something that we're going to be exploring in more depth in the next round. But one of the things that we saw in this previous round with 66 countries is that the funding model makes a difference. And I'm not sure there's a short-term answer to that question. I think we are, because we've been at it now for a decade and we haven't really hit upon something. So we really do need to explore more systematic and structural changes to deal with this economic issue. And then I guess the other thing is, if you're limited to those free publications that are more partisan, do read across publications. It's a hard habit, and of course we don't have time. We're busier than ever. But if there's an issue that's really important to you, it's wise to invest that time to even attend to transparently partisan media, but be inclusive about it. Look at different media outlets.
Okay. One more question. So social media is a very noisy place. What's the role of social media in marginalizing journalism?
Well, I'm not sure journalists have completely grappled with that yet. They've sort of embraced social media as a way to distribute their work. And I've done a fair amount of research on that as well. Journalists increasingly see themselves as having to market their own work, to push their own work out via social media channels. But the flip side of that is, then you're sort of putting yourself in a networked information environment, a public sphere, in which there are a lot of other non-journalistic actors. And if people aren't paying close attention, someplace that is not really a legitimate news outlet looks like a legitimate news outlet on social media. That's the other meaning of fake news, right? I mean, it's misinformation and disinformation that is out there in social media to look like it is journalism. So, you know, in that social media environment, it is. I was going to say plagued. It's plagued by disinformation and misinformation. And again, I think that just underscores the importance of journalism and having to seek out those professional sources that take the veracity of information seriously.
Well, thank you. This has been a very robust and engaging conversation, and thank you to everybody who's tuned in. Just a reminder that the presentation will be available in our live stream archive approximately 1 week afterwards, and that's the archive is located on the MSU Alumni Office website. Next week's presentation, we'll be joined by Mark Wilson, who is the professor in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction, and he'll be speaking on the topic of where are autonomous vehicles taking us. If you haven't yet registered for this presentation, you can do so up through this Wednesday, and we'll be sending I emphasize this, we do send out the Zoom link and password for each webinar the Wednesday prior. So when you register for Mark's presentation, you'll get the registration link and password on Wednesday. If you do not get it, please email me separately and I'll make sure you do. So thank you again. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. When you sign off, you'll have a quick survey will pop up asking you to rate today's presentation. If you wouldn't mind sharing your experience with us, we appreciate it. So thanks so much. Have a great day. Thank you, Tim, and go green.
Hello, MSU alumni. The credit union was founded in 1937 by MSU faculty and staff who were looking for an opportunity to be banked after the Depression. Over the last 83 years, the credit union has maintained being a partner with Michigan State University. As we approach serving nearly 300,000 Spartans across the world, we know that the more Spartans who choose to do business with the credit union help us to give even further support to the MSU community. Thank you in advance for the opportunity to serve you as a member of the credit union.